These Violent Delights, Chapter 20. At sunrise, it was early enough that the ports were quiet, the waves rocking against the floating boardwalk. It was early enough that the smell of the wind was still sweet, untainted by the smog of morning factories, absent of the aromas that rose from the fried foods and sloppy soups cooked in the stalls pushed upon the streets. Unfortunately, it still wasn't early enough to avoid a nationalist rally. Juliet halted in her step, freezing on the pavement underneath a swaying green tree. "Ta-ma-de," she cursed under her breath. "What are Kuomintang?" Roma answered before Juliet could finish the question. Juliet shot him a dirty look when he stepped beside her. Did he think her incapable of spotting the little suns on their hats? It wasn't exactly an obscure logo. The Kuomintang Party and their nationalists were growing incredibly popular. "I know," Juliet said, rolling her eyes. "I was going to ask what they're doing. This is my city. I don't need you educating me." Roma cast her glance askew. "Is it, though?" He hadn't even put any venom behind his tone, and yet those few words sent a dagger hurtling right through Juliet's heart. Is it, though? How many times had she asked herself that question in Manhattan? How many times had she climbed up to her building's rooftop and gazed out on New York's skyline, refusing to let herself love it, because loving one meant losing another, and losing Shanghai meant losing everything. "Now what is that supposed to mean?" she asked tightly. Roma looked almost amused by the question. He made a vague gesturing motion toward her, indicating her dress, her shoes. "Come on, Juliet. I've been here a lot longer than you have. You're an American girl at heart." And the implication of the words left unspoken were clear. Do us all a favor and go back. "Ah, yes," she muttered, the sharpness in her chest only twisted deeper. "Me and my American democracy. How am I managing in such a climate?" Before Roma could rebut anything further, Juliet started walking again, veering off their intended route. Instead of passing the rally gathered about the wide road, she hurried into a nearby alleyway, barely pausing for Roma to follow after her. He registered the change quickly. Soon the two of them were picking their way through trash bags and overturned food carts, scrunching their noses at stray animals and grimacing at the frequent puddles of blood. While they walked through the city's back roads, they were content to lapse into silence, content to pretend that the other was not present. When Roma whirled around, spinning so fast to face the scene behind them that Juliet immediately assumed they were under attack. "What?" she snapped, pivoting back too. She grabbed her pistol, then pointed wildly, waiting for something to jump out. "What is it?" Except Roma remained weaponless. He merely searched the street behind them, his brow scrunched. "I thought I heard something," he said. They waited. A bird dived into a garbage can. An exterior pipe gushed dirty water on the streets. "I don't see anything," Juliet said quietly, putting her weapon away. Roma frowned. He waited another second, but the scene was still. "My mistake, I apologize." He straightened his sleeve cups. "Let us continue." Hesitantly, Juliet turned and started to walk again. They were now far from the address that Kathleen had given her. This was a familiar part of the city. The goosebumps, however, remained on her arms. "He's only being paranoid," Juliet tried to reassure herself. The fear of being spotted together was already keeping both of them on their toes. Juliet had her coat collar pulled high to shield her face. Roma wore his hat low over his forehead, which was a good decision when he presently looked so unkempt that any onlooker on the street might run in another direction upon sighting him. In the bright daylight, the cuts of his face were stark against his pale skin. Judging by the shadow beneath his eyes, Juliet would not be surprised if he had not slept last night, likely tossing and turning in worry over Elisa. Juliet shook her head. She needed to clear her mind of her assumptions. For all she knew, he could also have been out killing Scarlets. "It's one of these buildings," Juliet said when they came upon the correct street. The houses were dilapidated and crowded, the spaces between each building barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. This area wasn't far from the French Concession, yet a tangible line could be drawn as a border between the two districts, and it was clear which half this street fell on. A long rectangular structure lay half crumpled under Juliet's feet. Perhaps a grandiose village gate had stood there once, etched with golden characters to welcome its oncomers. But it was gone now, torn apart for cityscapes and depravity. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Roma asked. Surely a newspaper job pays more than enough to move elsewhere. Of all people, Roma Montagov, Juliet said, you should understand the importance of image. One and the same, with the people, among the people. The communists never stopped preaching such ideals. If the common worker had to suffer, then Zhang Gutai must too. Else what other basis did he have for their respect? Juliet started toward the building, her address indicated. Then, 2 paces away from the main entrance, she abruptly paused. She pointed. Look. Roma stifled a sharp breath. Insects. A collection of their deadened husks lying out and open by the entrance of this apartment block. If this didn't scream guilty, Juliet didn't know what did. Pulse thudding, she pushed at the apartment building's entry door. The rusty lock came free and the door swung open. Juliet gestured for Roma to move faster. They worked their way up the stairs, grimacing at the cramped conditions. The stairs staggered up the building along one wall, then trickled straight into a parallel hallway with 4 doors not so far removed from one another. North, then south, north, then south. They trekked up the stairs, past the door on the floor, then moved up the next set of stairs, continuing the process in a dizzying sort of pattern. Roma was more used to this. Juliet was not. She hadn't lived within the city limits for years, nor felt the shift of the floorboards sigh under her feet as the entire structure seemed to heave. Which apartment is it? Roma asked. He sniffed as they passed a window sill on the 3rd floor's landing, eyeing the flower pots pushed right to the edge. One little nudge away from shattering on the pavement below. Juliet only stuck her index finger up at the sky. They kept climbing, up, up, up to the very top, reaching a floor with a sole door waiting right where the stairs ended. They paused. They exchanged a look. He's not home, Juliet reassured Roma before he could ask. She bent down on one knee and producing her thin needle-like dagger from the folds of her dress. I scanned the calendar in his office, meetings with important people all day today. Only as soon as Juliet inserted the dagger into the lock, her tongue poking out from her mouth in concentration, she heard the very distinct, undeniable echo of footsteps shuffling inside the apartment and toward the front door. Juliet! Roma hissed, rushing forward. Juliet bolted up, stashing her knife in her sleeve. She held her arm out to stop Roma in his tracks, gathering herself up in time before the doors flung open, and an old man blinked with them with filmy, squinting eyes. He was surely pushing 60, frazzled and weary-looking, as if he hadn't gotten enough sleep since he came out of the womb. "Hello?" the old man said, confused. Juliet thought fast. They could salvage this. This wasn't beyond saving. "Good morning. We're from the university," she exclaimed, dropping into another dialect. Wenhunese, so promptly that Roma jolted back the slightest inch, unable to conceal his astonishment at her quick switch. "Are you well on this fine morning?" The man leaned his ear forward, grimacing. In Shanghainese, he replied, "Speak Bendu Hua, would you, girl? I don't understand." Wenzhou was a city only days of travel to the north of Shanghai, but its local dialect was so incomprehensible to outsiders that Juliet would never have learned it had Nurse had taught her. Nurse used to say that the closest sound resembling Wenhunese was not a neighboring tongue like Shanghainese, but the chirping of songbirds. In a city not only bustling with foreigners, but also native Chinese from every corner of the country, most civilians shared a language, but they did not share the same way of speaking it. 2 Chinese merchants could carry on an entire conversation with each one speaking his own dialect. They didn't need to meet in the middle. They only needed to understand. Juliet, however, hadn't expected the old man to understand her at all. She had only one goal. Before he could squint closely at her face and recognize her for the air of the Scarlet Gang, she had to make him think she was a careless immigrant girl from elsewhere. "My apologies." She switched to Shanghainese. Task accomplished. "As I was saying, we're from Shanghai University and terribly excited to see you today. We're hoping to find the first student union club and need some advice. Is Mr. Zhang home to speak?" The old man straightened, brushing his hands over his knitted cardigan. Juliet expected him to turn them away, to tell them to come back some other time, so they could skitter out of sight and mark this off as a temporary failure. As long as they didn't raise suspicion, they could come back. as long as this man didn't pay too much attention to their faces and thought them regular university students who weren't worth remembering. She didn't expect the man to clear his throat imperiously and say, "I am Mr. Zhang." Roma and Juliet exchanged a perplexed glance. No, you're not." The man's posture sagged. He blew out a breath and abandoned his assuming air. "Fine. I am Qi Ren, Mr. Zhang's personal assistant. You may come in." Juliet blinked, first in confusion over this man's peculiarity, then in surprise that he was inviting them instead of turning them away. As she stood there, she felt a nudge from Roma, asking why she wasn't moving when Mr. Qi turned on his heel and shuffled away on his hard slippers. This wasn't her original plan, but Juliet was nothing if not adaptable. Come on, she muttered to Roma. They hurried in after Mr. Qi. "How shall I address you?" Mr. Qi called over his shoulder. Juliet didn't miss a beat. "Zhu Lai, and this is Mr. Montague. Lovely couches you have." She sat down before he could invite her to. Mr. Qi, frowning, moved aside a variety of folders on the nearby table, turning them over so his two-character name and Labor Daily's watermark were face down. "Will this take some time?" "If that works for you," Juliet replied brightly. Mr. Qi sighed. "I will go make some tea." As soon as Mr. Qi had moved far enough into the adjoining kitchen, busy with the task of boiling water, Roma turned to Juliet and hissed, "Montague? Really?" "Shut up," Juliet hissed back. "I couldn't think of anything else, and I didn't want to pause suspiciously." "You're fluent in Russian, and that's the best you could come up with?" Roma asked, flabbergasted. "What is a Montague? It sounds Italian." "There are Italian communists. Not in Shanghai." Juliet was prevented from responding when Mr. Qi stuck his head back in and asked what sort of tea they wanted. Once he returned deeper into the kitchen, satisfied with their polite answers that anything would do, Juliet ducked her head and said, "Okay, we can still do what we came here to do. You must distract him." "Say again?" Roma demanded. "You're going to leave me here to entertain?" "Is that a problem?" "Yes, it's a problem." Roma leaned back on the couch, his hands placed in his lap. "How do I know you're going to share whatever information you find if it doesn't benefit you?" He was perfectly valid to suspect her, but that doesn't mean Juliet liked the insinuation that she would sabotage this operation. "Stop arguing with me," she replied. "Our usual job description is intimidation and gunfire. If we can pull this off, we should count ourselves lucky. Frankly, do you wish to save Elisa or not?" Roma fell quiet. He clenched his fists, and Juliet couldn't tell if it was in reaction to her reminder about Elisa, or if it was to resist reaching out and strangling her. Mr. Qi returned right on cue, with a teapot and 3 round teacups balanced in his frail arms. Wasting no time, Juliet shot to her feet and asked for the washroom. Mr. Qi absently pointed down the hallway, while he placed the cups onto the table, and Juliet flounced off, leaving Roma to glare daggers after her as he started making up a story on the spot about the founding of Shanghai's University Communist Union Club, which neither of them were actually sure existed. It was his problem now. Juliet had bigger fish to fry. With her ears perked to ensure Roma was still rambling on about socialist solidarity, Juliet paused at the end of the dilapidated hallway. There were 4 doors, one wide open into the washroom, 2 propped ajar, and leading into bedrooms, and the 4th shut tight, unyielding, when Juliet jiggled the knob lightly. If Zangutai had anything to hide, it would be behind this door. Juliet braced, then smacked the flat of her palm so hard upon the knob that the simple lock clicked out of commission. Freezing for a brief second, Juliet waited to see if Mr. Qi would come running. When there was no interruption in Roma's spiel, she turned to the knob and slipped through the door. Juliet looked around. There was a red flag with a yellow hammer and sickle stretched across one of the walls. Beneath it, a large desk was overflowing with folders and textbooks, but Juliet didn't waste time scanning and when she approached. She dropped to her knees and pulled at the bottom drawer along with the side of the desk. Immediately, the first thing she saw was her own face, and though the paper was flimsy and thin and pressed of ink crooked, the render of her features completely awry and miscalculated, it was undoubtedly still her under a heading proclaiming, "Resist the Scarlet Gang." "Interesting," Juliet muttered. "But not what I'm looking for." She pushed the posters aside and dug deeper. All she found were papers upon papers of propaganda that had no relevance to her, smeared ink written with indicating terror in mind. In the second drawer, however, she discovered envelopes, all embellished with the scrawls of thick ink nibs, that stroke of power and wealth. Juliet thumbed through them quickly, throwing aside invitations from Kuomintang politicians and thinly veiled threats from bankers and businessmen, throwing aside anything that looked vaguely like it could waste her time. Her attention was snagged only when she came upon a little white square, in envelopes far smaller than the others. Unlike the rest, it did not have a return address. Instead, it had one purple flower in the corner, pressed in by a custom-made rubber stamp. "A larkspur," Juliet whispered, recognizing the image of the flower. She scrambled to retrieve the paper inside the envelope. It was merely a small slip of script, typewritten, and snipped to fit. "It was a pleasure to meet and discuss business. Let me know if you change your mind. Larkspur." For a long moment, Juliet could only stare at the note, her pulse pounding. What did it mean? What were all these pieces, part of a bigger puzzle, floating separating to each other but so clearly made to be joined? Juliet shoved the envelope back in and slammed the door shut. She smoothed down her dress, and before any more time could pass to incite suspicion over her absence, she strode out of the office, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She took 2 very large, deep breaths. Her heartbeat leveled down to its usual rate. "And really, our goals extended much further beyond revolution," Roma was saying when she casually wandered back into the sitting room. "There's planning to be done, opponents to eliminate." "All of which require resources much bigger than ourselves, of course," Juliet interjected, settling back down into the couch. She smiled wide enough that her canine slid over her bottom lip. "Now, where were we?" Zhu Lai. Juliet jerked to attention, eyes narrowing as she looked upon Roma. She had to squint because the sun was glaring brightly behind his head, flaring rays that illuminated him into overt clarity while they walked down the pavement. "Are you still on about the names?" "No, Roma made a sound that could have been a chuckle, if not for the hostility. I just understood. You translated Juliet into Chinese. Juliet. Zhu Lai." Roma had clearly been musing over the specific conundrum since the moment they left Zhang Gutai's apartment. After quickly telling him what she found in the office, Juliet had been content to walk without conversation as they picked their way back to the streets. Roma had seemed compliant to the example Juliet set, until now. "Nice detective work," Juliet intoned. She hopped down from the sidewalk to avoid a puddle, her heels clicking onto the road. Roma followed closely. Roma tilted his head to the side. It was almost bird-like, in a way he did it, quick and curious and void of ulterior motive. "I don't know your Chinese name." Juliet's eyes narrowed. "Does it matter?" "I'm only being civil." "Don't be." Another lull. This time Roma didn't hurry to fill it. This time he only waited. He knew that Juliet detested silence. She detested it so viciously that when it followed her around with the air of a ghoul, when it skipped between her and whomever she was walking with, whether it be enemy or friend, Juliet would scrape away at herself just to find a weapon to counter it. He stayed silent, and Juliet caved. "Kai Jun Lee," she said monotonously. Change up the pronunciation a little, and Jun Lee turned into Juliet. Her name was no secret. It was merely forgotten. She was just Juliet, the heiress who came from the West, with the American girl's dress and the American girl's name. If the people of Shanghai dug deep into the recesses of their memory, they would find Juliet's Chinese name lurking somewhere between the age of their grandfather and the residential address of their third favorite aunt. But it would never rise to their lips upon instinct. What was instead spoken was what Juliet had slowed down and distorted earlier into a full name, Zhu Lai. "You never told me," Roma said. He was starting ahead. "Back then." "There were lots of things I didn't tell you," Juliet replied, just as dully as she added, "back then." 4 years ago, the city was not the same. Many men still kept their hair long in what was called a queue, one braid trailing down their back, with the front of their scalp shaved. The women wore their garments loose, their pants straight. So everywhere Juliet went, she went in bright dresses. She sneered at the ugly clothes other girls wore, and when her mother dared attempt to have her adhere to the usual fashion, she tore the bland shirts from her closet and ripped them into shreds, letting the strips flush and swirls down the newly renovated plumbing. She trashed every kippah and tossed aside every silk scarf Lady Kai tried to compromise with, to avoid being recognized when she colluded with Roma. She threw coats over her gaudy dresses, and of course, but she was always treading the line of recklessness. Juliet had almost preferred the thought of being caught a traitor over putting on some clothes as everyone else. She would have rather been an outcast and admit the blood in her veins was a product of the East. Juliet liked to think she had come down a bit from her high horse since then. The second time she returned to New York, she had seen the darkness behind the glamour of the West. It was no longer so great to be a child constructed with Western parts. I picked it myself. Roma visibly startled at her words. He hadn't expected her to say anything more. Your name? He clarified. Juliet nodded. She did not look at him, did not even blink. She said, The kids in New York made fun of me. They asked what I was called, and then they laughed when I told them, repeating those foreign syllables back to me over and over again, as if speaking it in a song made it funny. She had been 5 years old. The wound of the mockery was healed now, covered by tough skin and rough calluses. But it still stung in bad days, as all old injuries did. My name was too Chinese for the West, Juliet continued, a wry smile on her lips. She didn't know why her face had morphed itself into amusement. She was anything but amused. You know how it is. Or maybe you don't. A temporary thing for a temporary place. But now the temporary thing is burrowed in so deep it cannot be removed. As soon as those words came out, Juliet felt a pang of nausea hit her throat. An immediate visceral reaction that she had said too much. Ditzy flapper Juliet, who was meant to help her survive the West, had dug her claws in so deep that the real Juliet didn't know where the facade stopped and where her true self began. If there was even anything left of her true self, or if there was anything in there to begin with. All her cousins, Rosalind, Kathleen, Tyler, they had English names to accommodate to the flood of Westerners controlling Shanghai, but their Chinese names still existed as part of their identity. Their relatives still addressed them as much on the occasion. Juliet was only ever Juliet. The air was sticky. They had been walking for long enough to enter the French concession, strolling alongside a row of identical houses with glaringly bright walls and generous patches of greenery. Juliet pulled at her collar, grimacing when Roma opened and closed his mouth. Juliet. There was a line between enemy and friend Was the line between enemy and friend horizontal or vertical? Was it a great pain to lumber across it, or was it a high, high wall, either to be scaled or kicked down in one big blow? We're done here, right? Juliet asked. Do what you will with this information. I'm sure the link between Zangutai and the Larkspur will give you plenty to work with. Juliet veered off, picking a shortcut through a yard that would take her to the next street. The grass here grew up to her ankles. When she dropped her shoe down, the ground seemed to swallow her, dipping and softening simply by her step. It felt like a welcome, a hurry, a come-through, until Roma clamped a hand on her shoulder, forcibly stopping her. You have got, Juliet spun around, slapping his hand off her, to stop doing that. We're not finished, Roma said. Yes, we are. The shadow of the nearby house were heavy. Roma and Juliet stood right where the shadows ended, right in the street divide between light and gloom. Roma looked her up and down. You still think it's a scheme within the communists, don't you? He asked suddenly. His voice dropped an octave, as if realizing that they needed to minimize the level of their argument while standing in a street like this. In the early morning light, it was hard to remember what danger tasted like. But one wrong move, one wrong person looking out their window at the right time, and they would both be in deep trouble. Roma, Juliet said coldly. We're done collaborating. No, we're not, Roma insisted. Because this isn't something you can investigate on your own. I can see what you're planning just by looking at you. You think you can simply insert yourself into the communist circle with your scarlet resources. Juliet took a step closer. She didn't know if this was the bright glare of sunlight reflecting off a nearby window, or if she was angry enough to be seeing white flaring from her vision. "You," she seethed, "don't know anything." "I know enough to see a pattern here with the larkspur." Roma clicked his fingers in her face. "Snap out of it, Juliet. You're only ignoring this clue because you wish to walk away from our collaboration and begin investigating other communists. It won't do anything. You're on the wrong path, and you know it." His words had a physical force to them, multiple stinging hits that struck her skin. Juliet could hardly breathe. Never mind find the energy to speak, to continue the stage whispers of their screaming match. She hated him so much. She hated that he was right. She hated that he was inciting this reaction in her, and most of all, she hated that she had to hate him. Because if she didn't, the hatred would turn right back to herself, and there would be nothing to hate except her own weak will. "You can't do that," Juliet said. She sounded more sad now than angry. She hated this. "You don't get to do that." If she leaned in, she could count the individual specks of pollen that had landed on the bridge of Roma's nose. The atmosphere here was too heady and strange and pastoral. The longer they remained, lined up with the pearly white walls, standing in the swaying grasses, the more Juliet felt ready to slough off a whole layer of skin. Why could she never remake herself? Why was she always bound to end up here? Roma blinked. He eased up his temper too, his whisper turning into a soft tone. "Do what?" "See me." Juliet turned away. She wrapped her arms around her waist. "What are you suggesting?" she asked in a lieu of reply. "Why have you latched onto the larkspur so intensely?" "Think about it," Roma said. He matched her steady, low tone. "Zangutai is the rumored maker of the madness. The larkspur is the rumored healer of the madness. How can there not be a link? How can there not have been something that passed between them at their meeting?" Juliet shook her head. "Link or no link, if we want to fix this at the root, we gotta go to the maker, not the healer. I'm not saying the larkspur has all the answers," Roma hurried to correct. "I'm saying the larkspur can lead us toward getting more out of Zangutai. I'm saying it's another way to the truth if Zangutai won't talk." He has some sense to his logic, Juliet thought. He's not wrong. Yet Juliet remained difficult. Her mother once told her that she had almost been born the wrong way around, feet first, because Juliet always refused the easy way out. "Why do you insist on convincing me?" she asks. "Why not go about confronting the larkspur alone? Bid me good riddance." Roma looked down. His fingers twitched in her direction. He might have been trying to resist reaching out for her, but Juliet booted that out of her thoughts as soon as it came on. Softness and longing were sentiments of the past. If Roma were ever again to run a tender finger down her spine, it would be to count her vertebrae and gouge where he could stab the knife in. "Listen, Juliet," he breathed. "We have two halves of one city. If I act alone, I am locked out of Scarlet territory. I won't risk losing out on a cure for my sister as soon as possible just because of our blood feud. The feud has taken enough. I won't let it take Elisa." His eyes shifted back to her, and in that gaze lay both sadness and rage, pooling outward until it surrounded the space between them. Juliet was right in the heart of that conflict, too. Horrified to have to counter this madness with a boy who had torn her to pieces, yet aching for this city for what had come down upon it. Roma extended his hand, hesitant. "Until this madness stops, that's all I ask. Between the two of us, we put the knives and guns and threats down for as long as it takes to stop our city from falling. Are you willing?" She shouldn't have been, but he had worded it just right. To Roma, saving Elisa was everything. Regardless of monsters or charlatan magical cures, all he wanted was for her to wake up again. To Juliet, it was the city that comes first, and the city she put first. She needed her people to stop dying. It was fortunate that these two such goals came together. Juliet extended her hand, tucked it into Roma's to shake. There was a jolt between them, a terrible hot spark as they both seemed to realize that, for the first time in 4 years, this was skin-to-skin contact without malice. Juliet felt like she had swallowed a burning hot coal. "Until the madness stops," she whispered. They pumped twice, then Roma turned their hands so he was on the bottom and Juliet was on the top. If they couldn't have anything, then they could at least have this. A second, a whimsy, a fantasy, before Juliet came to her senses and jerked her hand away, returning it to her side with her fist clenching. Tomorrow, then, Roma decided. His voice was rough. We hunt the larkspur.